Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Let's Talk NFT. My name is Kirsty Buchanan. I'm the Business Engagement Executive for Interface, and I'm chairing on behalf of Interface. We're a public service provider with funding of up to £5,000 for Scottish businesses to collaborate with Scottish universities on an innovative project. So if you have ideas to innovate in the blockchain space or any other space, please do reach out. And if you live outside of Scotland currently, check out our Inward Investment Fund. I'll include a link for the details of that. I'm really excited to have everyone here today for a very relevant and very timely topic. I think the title represents a great opportunity to create a really interactive session guided by you, our audience. So it'd be really helpful to know you better. Be brave enough to use the chat function, the Q&A function specifically. Let's talk to each other, help each other to grow our knowledge base and networks in this area, and ask lots of questions, because we have a panel of 4 NFT experts here who are really excited about what they're building in this space. I think we actually have 3, but we're hoping for our 4th to join. I'm delighted to introduce you to our first speaker, Frances Liddell. She's a researcher, writer, and advisor, and one of the first PhD students to actively apply NFT into museums. Frances, welcome to you. Talk to us a bit about your PhD research, which actually explored the application of blockchain, specifically non-fungible tokens, in museums.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsty. Yeah, so I started my PhD, well, I've completed it. I attained it earlier this year, but I started it back in 2018, which was kind of around a kind of real initial hype of blockchains. There was a real kind of excitement in the air. And particularly with NFTs was when we first started seeing the kind of first application of these kind of non-fungible tokens, particularly on the Ethereum blockchain. And with my background, I'm sort of coming from an arts management museum theory kind of aspect. And I was really interested in thinking about kind of open access and internet culture, and thinking about ideas around kind of how are we creating collective ownership online, and how does kind of open access promote those ideas, and this idea particularly of as well as shared authority. And NFTs just really took, I took my interest. It was, and I just felt there was so much, so many relatable ideas with what blockchains was attempting to do with this idea. So I had this incredible opportunity to work with National Museums of Liverpool on this 3-year project, where we just, deep dived into it. None of us really knew a great deal, but we just wanted to just think, well, how can we use this technology, not necessarily to create something that could be considered a success, but actually how could we extend our understanding of what do we mean by digital ownership and authenticity and authority with the use of these tokens. So in brief, we basically worked with a group of participants to create an online exhibition called Crypto Connections, and I can post the link in the chat later on, where we basically explored the personal relationship to objects. And we did that with the focus of the fact that the participants had very little knowledge about blockchain. So really the real focus was about kind of how do we engage with people and create something together. But then from that, we made NFTs of each of the objects. And we did that using a smart contract connected to the Ethereum blockchain. And so each participant owns an NFT of the objects and their personal experiences about the objects, kind of permanently connected together, essentially. And through that, then I was thinking about how does that create ideas around, as I say, collective ownership, but really actually thinking about this idea of guardianship, and thinking about questions around authority and authenticity as well. So that's kind of in brief what we attempted to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us a quick overview of what you were working on with your PhD, and we're going to come back to lots of questions definitely about that. I'd like to introduce also Laurence O'Bryan. Now I know Laurence has been a very busy man this afternoon, so I appreciate your time today, Laurence. You have over 30 years in marketing experience and over 20 years in writing experience. What brought you to create the first NFT ebook, and why is it important not to race to the conclusion that NFTs will make you millions?
Well, I don't think we created the first ebook NFT. I know there were a few on, there's been a series of them on OpenSea for some time, and so people have been selling NFT ebooks for a while with various success, and some in the form of funding various stages of a project. So there's been various tests of putting ebooks into NFTs. What we believe we're the first is creating an ebook NFT marketplace that is a collection of books and a place where people can buy and sell them. So that's what we believe. We certainly haven't seen anyone else creating that NFT. But the reason we got involved is a lot of it's about technology and the restrictions that have been placed on us by large companies such as Amazon, which sets you have to set your ebook price between $2.99 and $9.99 to get their 70% royalty rate, and that hasn't changed in about 12 years. And that means that author incomes are being pressed down. We don't have the freedom to set an ebook price at $19.99 and still make 70%. We go down to 35%, which, as you can imagine, with the slowdown in sales expected, if you put that price up, it's going to lead to a loss in earnings. And being restricted by companies like Amazon and the other big retailers also have similar restrictions, means that we also can't bundle other things. So if we have video files, for instance, background, archive, and other material that we want to bundle with our NFT or bundle with our product and sell it to people, that we can't do that currently under Amazon's restrictions. So that, coupled with the fact that with NFTs that you can allow people the right to resell the item, the digital item, the zip file, whatever digital item, image, whatever you sell to them, that through the contract, the NFT contract, you're giving people the right to resell it, which I think is an astounding innovation. And really, the first time you think about it, you think that's impossible. Surely people can just copy and resell, but you can't. You don't have the right to, if you take an image down off the web, you don't have the right to resell it. But if you bought something with a specific contract stating you have the right to resell it, then you're happy to leave that, as a legacy for your children or whatever, that you can keep it and sell it in 10 years' time. That concept is amazing. And also the amazing concept of getting a percentage of the residual rights when the contract is resold, when the item, digital item, is resold later as an NFT. The original author can get a percentage of the original, percentage of the sale price, which seems fair to me. It's been working in the large art market for a couple of decades now, I think, and I think it seems right. So that's the reason we've got involved in all of that. What was the second part of your question, Kirsty?
I said, just to quickly touch upon why is it important not to come into the space thinking you're going to make millions straight away from your first NFT?
Well, that era is gone, and so we don't encourage that. We're not doing this as investment or a get-rich-quick scheme. This is a test of technology. This is trying to see what will happen in the next 10 years. So please, if you've got any thoughts that you're going to suddenly, make a fortune, that's not the way it's working. Certainly now with the NFT, the market has collapsed. For some of those trading, art trading and game trading, but it's not going to die because there's too much technical validity to what's happening, and there are a lot of firms who are working in this space with a lot of money.
Well, thank you for explaining it so well, and it led nicely from Francis's authenticity and ownership discussion. I'd like to invite now Chris Cummings into the conversation. Chris is the founder and CEO of Pass It Down and Iconic Moments. He created one of the first NFT marketplaces exclusively for historical and cultural brands. Chris, tell us a bit more about the work that you're doing and how did you come to create Iconic Moments?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, thank you for the opportunity to speak. And it's a pleasure to meet everyone. I've been working with cultural institutions and corporate history and storytelling departments for over 6 years. And so we've always taken a digital first approach. Cultural institutions need to strive to engage digitally and to be able to drive revenue digitally, because so much of the economic models behind these industries are the same model that's been there for 1,000 years. Very much built on that in-person experience and that need for someone to physically walk through the door to drive revenue. And so when we saw COVID's impact on the cultural heritage industry, 93% of museums worldwide closed at the exact same time. 30% of museums and cultural institutions globally at risk of closing forever. Here in the States, 25% of museums with less than 4 months cash. We really felt like there needed to be a better model to sustain and to thrive these institutions we really care about. So, when we looked at NFTs and Web3, what we really saw was an opportunity to focus on that digital first model. But when we looked at the options for NFTs, we really felt like they weren't aligning with a lot of the goals of the industry. The biggest problem with OpenSea is if you try to create an NFT there, which is easy, you're one of 45 to 50 million NFTs available at any given moment. So yes, you could create this beautiful historic or cultural NFT, but it's next to a dancing unicorn, it's next to a trading card. So it's hard to create that experience. And then the problem as well is that there's no ability within these platforms to really focus on telling the story or the context behind the pieces. What is the story of the artwork or the story of this historical moment? What is the story of the museum or the cultural institution? What is the social impact that comes from a purchase? How can you make this also function as a ticket or a membership? And that's really what we strive to create, because we didn't see an opportunity with pre-existing Web3 technology to do that. So for us, we're working with 25 of the top museums around the world and talks with like another 150 across 12 countries. We were lucky enough to win the United Nations World Summit Award a few months ago for innovation in culture and tourism. And we're really striving to just listen to our clients and museums and cultural institutions and create the experience that doesn't exist that solves the goals of this industry.
You're making a real impact in that sector with this emerging technology. Well done. You've obviously spotted a challenge and an excellent solution that NFT could fit into. Francis, I'm going to bring you in again. Explain a bit more about ownership and authenticity around NFTs. How does it actually all work, and what do we know about IP generation?
Yeah, so that's some big questions there. Well, so the thing is so what I talk about in my thesis is this idea of simulation. And actually, when we're talking about authenticity, we quite often only think about authenticness as a kind of one state kind of concept. And particularly when we talk about art market, we're thinking about provenance, evidence, looking at materials and the history to prove the authenticity of a work. But actually authenticity is very layered. We can bring in questions around aura, we can bring in things what actually is termed as iconic authenticity, the idea of kind of things being perceived by building on our stereotypes of, to take an example, historic houses, for example, actually put inauthentic objects into their collections because it continues to tell the story. So it creates an authentic experience. So we call that, for example, iconic authenticity. And what blockchain does is it really focuses on what we might call the kind of nominal authenticity, that provenance, that idea of process of authentication. But what it lacks is the ability to create something that is truly original in the sense of like something physically original. So in other words, if you have something physical and it's only unique and you can't copy it, whilst in the digital space, blockchain doesn't do that. It only creates a form of identification. And that is still a sense of authenticity, but it's really then thinking about, well, do you believe it? And that's why I call it simulated, because it gives you such a sense of realness that you can believe it and you can actually say that's authentic, but it also acknowledges that not everyone will agree that that is an authentic object. When it comes to ownership as well, you could kind of continue with this theme of simulation. Again, it's about this idea of being identified with a work. And again, when it comes to artists making NFTs, this is a really big opportunity for them. They can finally, particularly when we're thinking about digital media, they can be finally attributed permanently to their works through the fact of having an NFT and selling it, because you have that documentation on the blockchain to always lead back to that artist. Now, on the other end of things with ownership as well, and as I briefly mentioned earlier, is this idea of guardianship. And again, ownership is very multidimensional in its nature. We could talk about formal ownership rights, and we could talk about this idea of right to be attributed and the moral rights. But you could also talk about the concept of kind of psychological ownership and actually what it means that when you gift someone a token, an NFT, as I did with my research, through a process of engagement and collaboration, the NFT becomes much more than simply just you own that. It actually opens up a kind of potential ongoing relationship. And this is something that I kind of have been trying to push for museums to think about much more, is actually when you make these NFTs, what do you actually want to do with these? What do you want to do with the token, but also what do you want to do with the audiences that own them? do you want them to flip them and invest in them and do the kind of speculative market thing? Or do you want them to actually feel like patrons? Do you want them to feel like they've adopted that NFT and they have a duty of care over it? Because this is what's so exciting about NFTs, is that it creates, again, what I call digital thingness. And with that also brings this new sense of like, well, if it has a sense of thingness, you can also sense a kind of active sense of care over it as well. So yeah, that's kind of those two ideas, very brief.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And Laurence, just bringing your thoughts into this question, how are your writers paid through NFTs?
Well, we get paid first, and then we pay directly. We pay 80% of the proceeds to the authors. I think it's interesting about that authenticity as well, because we have, of course, a challenge with books. So we have to be sure that the author who gives us something, because we then take the responsibility of selling that belongs to that person. So typically we use ISBN numbers and a contract with the author, which assures us that they hold the copyright of the item provided to us. It's slightly different when it's a cultural institution and they know that they are probably the owner of that item. But dealing with people who submit things to you, to your marketplace to sell them, then you've got the challenge of making sure that it's an authentic. So there is an international authenticity organization, which we're also part of, which has various guides, for making sure that what you're selling as an NFT is authentic. But it is an interesting issue because who else is involved then in creating the work? So for instance, could there be editors or cover designers or proofreaders? And in fact, the author can decide to cut in all of those people. So who's responsible as for ownership? When you've created something with a book, it's often a team endeavor. So it's not just one person. And can you cut? So could we end up in a world where each of those people gets a small slice, because the cover is hugely important to the sale of any ebook, NFT, and other items, video, and all sorts of other things. So that ownership conversation gets complex, and then each of those people have to assure you that the cover designer has used an original piece of artwork, that they haven't taken that artwork for somewhere. So it goes down levels. So we rely on the contract we have to ensure that is, to as much as possible, that is the case.
Thank you, Laurence. And what about you, Chris? What's your thoughts? Space and the authenticity and ownership and how people get paid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, in general, one of the things that helped NFTs to really have an uptick is their ability to solve the starving artist problem, right? The ability to include in a smart contract a royalty on any and all secondary transactions, so that whoever the creator is can really benefit through the lifetime value of whatever that work is as a whole. That's fundamentally a good piece of technology, right? Like Laurence spoke about earlier, how even with the ups and the downs and the volatility, there's some core pieces here technologically that are really valuable, and that's one of the main components. And I think Francis is also absolutely right around what is the experience you want to create for that sense of ownership or support or a community. If you're going to engage in NFTs, are you doing it to drive speculative sales, or are you doing it to try to get that sense of supporting the shared cause? And part of what makes NFTs interesting is that you can technically lay out benefits that accrue over the duration of you holding something. So for example, you could say if you hold this NFT for 1 month, you're going to get a ticket to the special event. If you hold it for a year, you're going to unlock this entire other experience. And then you have an entire community that can essentially work together and communicate together around this cause and all the benefits that can occur through shared holding of a particular item. So, I mean, I think that's where NFTs can get super exciting, and it's not an area that I think is discussed enough when it comes to NFTs.
What would you say is for those that really don't understand what an NFT is, because I think we've got a mixed audience here, what's the best way to get your head around NFTs?
Yeah, I think most people's experience of NFTs when they heard about them was through Beeple, right? They're like, okay, there's this like crazy $69 million piece of artwork that's out there. And people go, what do I get? What do I have? What is an NFT? And people go, do I really own it? Is it just digital? Taking a step back, right? NFTs themselves are just a way of being able to essentially execute a smart contract and to be able to show that entire contract's execution publicly 24/7, 365 to anyone that's interested, right? So it's very similar to if you go to a governmental office to go look up a property deed. You can look up a piece of property, you can see who is listed as owning the property on this piece of paper, and you can see the entire provenance or history of that. And so for that reason, NFTs have been applied to every industry, not just art, not just digital collectibles. They're being used in real estate, they're being used in logistics. It's just a better way of contracting. Like in another life, I was a federal attorney. It's a way of really saying we don't need to pay attorneys this much for 3-4 days of review. If the set of rules are made, we can execute a contract immediately and save a lot of money and efficiently. But I think when applied to museums and culture, it's often through this lens of either functioning as like a lithographic print or a limited edition print, similar to something a museum might sell in a gift shop. It might be a way of having fractional ownership of an item that is sitting in a private collection, but we want the public to be able to see it. And it could function as a ticket or a membership tool. But I'd love to hear Laurence and Francis's thoughts in general on that.
Definitely. Francis, again, just for you for the just basics, what is an NFT and the ownership side of things, definitely.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose the kind of basic definition is that it's a certificate of ownership or authenticity for something that could be both digital or physical. But really, so normally what I show in kind of presentations when I talk about NFTs is actually the front end of the smart contract that we use to create or mint our NFTs during the project. Because ultimately NFTs, although I call them things, they are actually made up of lots of different parts. They are pieces of information. And that includes things like a title, the owner ID, a timestamp, and then also things like metadata. So for example, in my project, that was like the person's like personal experience in the metadata, and then a link to an image file or any form of file essentially. Because the key thing to understand with NFTs is that it's not the file itself, because we have this issue with blockchain in that sense that it would cost too much and be too much of a heavy load of data for the chain if you were to store everything on the ledger. So instead, we store them on decentralized systems, often one called IPFS or Interplanetary File System, but Arweave is also a really popular one in recent years. And essentially what that does is that it allows you to store things still in kind of peer-to-peer network, but you can have this permanent link attached to the token. And this is where people suddenly get going very confused then, because then you're like, well, there's two different things here. But ultimately, this is why perhaps it's easier sometimes to think about the NFT as a certificate or even just a receipt. And ultimately, as Chris says, it's a lot about kind of and Laurence as well was talking about the rights associated that you can embed into the smart contract. In the end of the day, NFTs as a thing in themselves really have no value. It's artificially created. And it's ultimately about what rights you choose to attach to the NFT that makes it valuable in itself. Whether that's also just whether the file itself as well, and whether you just like the artwork attached to it, but also things like supporting the artist for resale rights, or you want to have the right to exhibit, to loan, or so on and so forth. So that again is kind of a really important point to highlight with this idea of the NFT.
Thank you so much, Francis. And Laurence, again, with ownership rights, what you've done in terms of your NFTs and supporting writers to make sure that they are continued to be paid for the work that they do long after it's resold. Explain a bit about that and how that works.
Yes. So on the blockchain that we use, the system uses cryptocurrency, which is Wax. That currently allows reselling of the NFTs on the eBay. store as well. And there are other, but eBay is probably the most well-known. So they were the first to be approved by eBay, which means that when people buy our and wax-based, and there's a lot of others using wax, William Shatner, Marvel, Atari, and the list is quite long, who've been selling everything from baseball cards, gaming devices, through to our ebook NFTs. I just wanted to say something about my concept about the definition of what is an NFT, which is I wish it was called a digital file you can resell, and that is, for me, the simple. It includes the item, that it's a contract, so you can resell it. It's something you've been given permission to resell, and that we're all familiar with the idea of buying a book, a secondhand book, which could be worth £1,000. We're all familiar with the idea that we don't assume that we own copyright for that book when we buy a single copy. And the same thing applies to NFTs. Don't assume you own the right to make 1,000 copies of your NFT. As if you've gone into a secondhand bookstore and bought a £1,000 very special edition that you can keep, enjoy, and resell your book. And that this is a digital file which you can keep, enjoy, and resell. It's very simple, really, and it just goes against what people are used to with digital files. That they can copy, make 1,000 copies if you want, but that doesn't mean you have the legal right to resell a photograph or any other digital file just because you can make copies. So it goes against what we've been brought up with. Our culture has been doing with digital items in the last 20 or 30 years. So that goes against it, and it provides us with opportunities. So what was the next part of your question? Sorry, I didn't cover everything. Gone.
It was just really about how the artist continues to get paid, long after the initial sale.
Oh, okay. So if the artist sells, if the purchaser sells the item, they are obliged to provide a part of that proceeds. Now, we'll get into the enforcement part here. So we have a percentage comes back to us, and a percentage goes back to the artist. So we haven't reached the stage of trying to enforce that yet, which is an interesting conversation on how to enforce those. But on the wax system, when that contract is sold on eBay, it is recorded on the wax system, and a notice comes back to us that part of that sale price comes back to us for both ourselves as the marketplace owner and to the author. So that is, and this is something which is going to be developing further over the rest of this decade, about the enforcement of those rights as well. I don't know how anybody else sees the enforcement of secondary rights, or have you encountered any of that yet?
Chris, would you like to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the interesting areas of technology that needs to be developed is sort of the clear accounting principles, particularly if your NFTs are being sold on a secondary and in the secondary marketplace you're not in control of. So let's say, you sell an NFT initially on your own platform, and then it resells on OpenSea. The problem right now is that, let's say, there's 1,000 resales of something you've done. It's very unclear in the documents that you get back, who's resold to, how often, the amounts. And so it's very difficult to be able to track that. I think the most efficient thing you can do, right, is build into the smart contract the divvying of the funds. It's easy to do that with up to 5 wallets, meaning, let's go with Laurence's example. You are selling a book on a platform. The platform is going to receive a fee. The author is going to receive a fee. The artist is going to receive a fee, right? But if you start trying to divvy funds up past 5 folks, it becomes very, very complicated right now. And so the problem is it's very difficult with pre-existing technology to track and to know sort of those full royalties across the board. There are conventional legal mechanisms you can use and legal systems you can use. So you can sue someone and say, I want full accountability or auditing to be able to show that I've been paid what I'm paid or not. But I think the gap really is on the technology and these marketplaces providing clear transparency around all the transactions that have taken place.
Yeah, and I'm just going to come in there as well, because first of all, some recommendations of Sarah Odenkirk is a fantastic lawyer in the US who has done a huge amount of discussions and has also worked with a couple of artists about kind of smart contracts and the issues, the fact that they are not law. But also this kind of issue of accountability, and something as well that kind of comes through is often with these platforms is that it just comes, it's not actually embedded into the smart contract at all. It's actually embedded into the terms and conditions of the website, aka the enforceability aspect can be easily changed and mutable, which completely goes against the kind of concept of using blockchain in the first place. So there is huge amounts of issues still about this kind of copyright and what exactly can blockchains offer. Certainly work that was being done in sort of 2018, 2019 about this, because this was kind of a big exciting thing that was being talked about a lot in that time, was kind of the issue of like, do you use a permissioned blockchain? So the blockchains we're talking about at the moment are publicly available. Anyone can write, read, exchange with each other. Permissioned blockchains work in a slightly different way. Sometimes they are open to read, but only certain people can execute on them. Basically meaning it's become centralized. But with that means that things like copyright, you can then embed and you can control it much more, because unfortunately there is the kind of this issue. The other resource actually thinking about then collaboration is the Serpentine Legal Lab is a really great resource. Again, they have posted a number of reports, again, looking at smart contracts and the law, but also thinking very specifically about how do you embed collaborations into smart contracts? Because again, as we've talked about already, it's really not something that is possible on a lot of the platforms at the moment. You essentially have to create your own smart contract, and even then you can only have so many people before it becomes very complicated. But yeah, I'll post those links in the chat.
Just to add another layer where we may be going, we're in negotiations to put our NFTs in a metaverse and to have them as a bookshelf in a space station simulation metaverse. And the interesting thing about that is this tracking question is that the people who will join the metaverse will be people whose ID has been authenticated. So if they, in the metaverse, if they buy an NFT, a wax NFT, it's delivered to them. It takes away some of the anonymity, which is one of the problems of enforceability, that you can't track somebody and place it, for instance, against their reputation or do something like that. So that is another place where we can look at where this may be developing into, which is having your NFTs, it could be your museum artifacts or others, available in a metaverse with every participant tracked.
Amazing. That's really brings in the decentralization part of blockchain, the peer-to-peer aspect. Can anyone really talk to, the importance of that and what that actually means?
Oh, Laurence, go ahead, sir. I'm gonna give you the floor.
No, please do. I was speaking. Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, Chris. Come on.
Oh, not at all. I mean, I think there is it's a tug and pull between your options here of a fully decentralized platform or a centralized experience, and each one has its own advantages and disadvantages, right? If you go with what's called kind of like a walled garden or a more centralized experience, if you've heard of NBA Top Shot, it's a very similar experience to this. You are controlling essentially the entire experience from beginning to end, and you're able to set a lot of the rules and permissions that you're looking for. It's very easy to control what wallets people are interacting with, the ability to use credit cards that people are interacting with to make sure that what's being sold is really yours, because it can't leave that walled garden across the board. And so you're able to avoid a lot of fraud or issues that do appear with NFTs. in general. And so a lot of the best experiences that have been created in kind of like a very meaningful way that haven't had, issues with their communities or any type of attacks have been a more centralized experience, but at the exact same time, right, there's several that would argue that's more of a Web 2 solution than a Web 3 solution. If we're talking about a fully decentralized experience, there's a lot of value there, but then there's also a lot of risk, and a lot of the technology to make this less risky is being developed now, but it isn't out. One of the risks are you need to make sure that your NFTs are going onto platforms that support wallets that only have KYC, so that your NFTs are being sold to people that have verified their identity. So they're not being used for money laundering, drug trafficking, a lot of nefarious things in general, right? If it is in a fully decentralized experience, your identity is tied to a wallet address, purely a wallet address. And so right now, for everyday consumers, everyday people, you're having to rely on the belief that that wallet address is tied to the person who says it's tied to, right? That it's tied to that account. And you have to learn how to be able to engage with some very complicated wallets, and it's very easy to lose your money. So I think that where we are with the question of centralization or decentralization, there's not a right answer or a wrong answer. It's just we're very early in the technology, and there's pros and cons to both.
Thank you so much, Chris. And it's that anonymity part is quite interesting as well, because we're not completely anonymous, we're pseudonymous, I think is what the terminology is. And I think that's one thing, is getting the language right. So for anyone that doesn't understand what Web 1, Web 2, Web 3 is, can anyone talk to that to maybe fill in those blanks for any listeners that don't really understand the difference between those Web 1, Web 2, Web 3?
I'm happy to speak to that. So again, there's a classic analogy that I tend to use, which hopefully people will understand. But with Web 1, we always call it the read internet. So, you had this ability to create your own website, and you could read other people's information or their content. There was some e-commerce, but really there was quite limited in what you could do. But Web 2, post 2004 is this kind of addition of social media. So it's the read and write web, because you can not only read, but you can also start adding comments, you can add your own content. And we had platforms emerge where literally they only built on users' content, things like Facebook and Twitter and so forth. But what Web 3 does, it brings in the ability to execute. So you have the read, write, and execute web. And that basically means that users become much more autonomous. And it's this idea of decentralization that we've been talking about. Suddenly, you don't need to have those middlemen to do the things that you could do previously. You don't need Facebook in order to interact with each other. You can interact with each other through, for example, blockchains, without needing, PayPal or whatever to actually exchange with each other. So that is in itself kind of the main kind of differences. And ultimately Web 3 then is what kind of underpins all of it, is blockchain technology, which is also the thing that we've been talking about throughout this, is, the decentralized distributed ledger that all these tokens are stored or recorded within, and allow these things to run. So hopefully that makes sense to people.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Frances. And I'm very aware that we could have some comments here or some questions, but I really encourage everyone to really make the most of this session. Try and put your questions in for our experts. They're here and ready to answer them. We do have a question from Tim, but I believed Laurence did actually answer that earlier. So while we wait for more comments to come in, I'd just like to understand, where do you think, I'll ask for everyone to answer, but where do you think NFTs are going? Is this a fad? What's going to happen with the NFT space?
Well, I don't think it's a fad because of the technological advances. And we've heard that about a lot of things. They're fads. I think people thought the motor car was a fad 100 years ago, and particularly the people in charge of the horse and carriage industry. And so on through many different technological changes. And it's because, and we see the variety of applications and museums and things which I wasn't aware of. And I'm also aware of, huge variety of other applications in finance and all sorts of other areas. Huge list. Just put in applications of NFTs into your Google search engine, and you'll see there are thousands of applications and potential applications. The problem is we're at the beginning, and we've spoken about some of the challenges about digital ID and how we're going to identify and authenticate ourselves, for residual rights, all of that sort of thing. There are problems with all of that, but those can be resolved, and they will be resolved often because the marketplace will come up with solutions. And we're looking at things like what's beyond TikTok. TikTok is huge, and it's going to be the big hit this year again. In downloads, the #1 download. But we're looking beyond that. What's going to be here in 3 and 5 years? When, like, Facebook is waning, when TikTok is waning, which is essentially a Web 2 sort of environment, and how can we contribute what we're creating and making? A lot of us are working in the digital field. How can we contribute and sell? Could we sell our time as an NFT? So there's new applications, and what it requires is imagination, new applications, because if we can authenticate that, if we can have a cut. For instance, if I sell my time to somebody and they resell, they package it up with 5 other people's content and sell it as something, and I get 0.5% of the eventual product, then wouldn't that be nice? So this NFT opens up those possibilities, our time, our work, our digital assets, that all of those can be used and utilized in new ways, and we can get repaid. So we've talked about some of the challenges in that area, but I think what's been illustrated here is some of the potential. We're really just scratching the surface on the potential. So that's my take. It's going to be here, and it's because of the people who are here, and 1,000, 100,000 more out there in the field doing things.
Yeah, it's a really exciting space to be in at the moment. Any further thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, whenever anyone brings up the question whether NFTs are a fad, I always like to point out that the desire to own digital items and to be able to exchange digital items has existed and been proven out for the last 20 years in the video game industry before we ever actually had NFTs, right? In the video game industry, video game companies would sell digital cosmetic items in video games, a skin, an outfit, or a character or a weapon. And there's been over $100 billion bought of those digital items over the last 20 years. And people, so much so, right, place value on those items, but didn't have the platform solutions to be able to exchange or take those items with them. That entire black markets popped up to be able to sell video game characters because people wanted to be able to purchase these digital items. So in general, right, we've seen this behavior around the desire to collect digital items. And I'm specifically applying this story to the lens of digital art, not the other legal uses of NFTs like real estate and others, long before NFTs came about. And so the way that I look at NFTs is it's actually just creating platforms and solutions to facilitate the exchange of a human behavior that's been established and proven through the markets for a very, very long time. I think obviously the technology needs to get better. But again, the internet was terrible to use through the beginning. Most new technology, most emerging technology is very complicated, inefficient, hard to use. That's why you have your early adopter base, and then the technology begins to get easier and easier, and you start to shift to mainstream markets. But again, I don't think NFTs are a fad just based on sort of like past economic behavior within digital.
Just to speak to that, I mean, I think Chris raises a good point as well. The fact that like collecting is an intrinsic human behavior, but also to point out that things like digital media and digital art, there were always digital art collectors, way back, since it's sort of becoming, since the 60s when we started seeing the first emergence of new media art, without the need of NFTs. But NFTs facilitate that process. But the point that I really wanted to reflect on was actually, there's this issue that you could become a bit of kind of, just promoting, like, come use blockchain, it's great, which is certainly just like so far from what I would want. I actually don't believe that Web3 is necessarily the right tool for every museum and gallery, certainly at the moment, because you've got to think about your audiences and what they want. So when we're thinking about this idea of, is it a fad, it's actually thinking about, well, how are you using the technology, and how are you using it simply as a tool or a means for economic growth? Or are you using it and playing with it and manipulating it and experimenting with it, and the very concepts or core ideas deep down within kind of what blockchain kind of identifies with, things like decentralization, distributed ownership, governance, all these terms are things that you can start playing with through the spirit of Web3. And certainly I think this is something that I would push museums to start thinking about, is not necessarily use the technology, but start challenging yourself about your current models of ownership, your current models of how you authenticate. What does blockchain offer in terms of extending your knowledge or helping you to think through those ideas to get to the next level of understanding?
That's brilliant advice, Frances. Thank you so much. And I noticed that we do actually have quite a few comments coming in now. Chris, this one stood out to you. Do you favour any particular format of NFTs, audio, video, images, 3D, etc.?
No, I mean, I think in essence, right, NFTs are not they're not based around a particular media type, right? It's just a way of essentially facilitating a smart contract or an exchange, and they can be used for any media or any property. It could be real items, digital items. It could be, there was a DAO based around purchasing a golf course where people came together to be able to have a shared ownership and community around an actual physical golf course business. We've seen this applied to the DAO for the Constitution here in the States, or a variety. I think, to Frances's point, it's very important to look at it as a medium to experiment with, to try to create better outcomes, or to question the assumptions that our models are built on. So no, I don't have any particular format in general across that board.
Excellent. We've got another one here. Again, there's interest in knowing if any of the speakers have come across a heritage organisation creating an NFT of an artifact to be used in a virtual world or a gaming environment. So, for example, you can fight in a game with an ancient sword, for example.
There's some good examples and some bad examples, or good ideas that were not executed well. Fortnite did a partnership with either the MLK Museum or the MLK Foundation to place essentially a digital museum in the game, but then they forgot to turn off the ability to use weapons in the space. And so it was a good idea in concept that had like a bad output. There are a lot of new games that are being created specifically on the blockchain itself, where the NFT is completely tied into the game engine and the economy. But ironically, there's also been a lot of the traditional gaming companies have faced a lot of controversy over trying to incorporate NFTs into their games, which is ironic because loot boxes have essentially functioned the same way. But yeah, there are a number, but specifically within heritage, the only one I know of is the MLK group with Fortnite. And again, good idea, that bad in execution.
I would say actually go look at the Morpheus project on creating an educational metaverse, and they've been working with the Imperial War Museum and the Science Group in the UK, creating some really interesting kind of immersive environments. In terms of kind of arts, I mean, there's a huge amount of galleries that have been using them for many years, way before the metaverse became called the metaverse, and we were still calling them virtual worlds. Second Life, for example, is filled with museums, both online only and physical forms. I would go check out New Art City as well. It's filled with incredible work, artists curating. Places like sort of Rhizome from the New Museum have done a number of exhibits there as well. So if you want to look at kind of heritage works or artworks from a kind of, curatorial standpoint, I think that's a really high quality example there.
Thank you for sharing the resources as well, which would be really helpful for our listeners in terms of, so if you have any links at all, feel free to put them in the chat function. Another question, unless Laurence, you had anything to come in with that?
No, that was well done.
I'll get through some of these questions then. I'll just ask you then, Laurence, why do you think that sport and high fashion seem to be adopting NFTs quicker than other sectors?
What in high fashion?
It says, why do you think sport and high fashion seem to be adopting NFTs quicker than other sectors?
Oh, yes, I'm aware that, for instance, I think it was the Los Angeles Dodgers, or perhaps they're still selling them. And when you go to a game, big baseball game in the States, that you can buy, I'm not sure which team, I may have got the team wrong, but someone was telling me they could buy at halftime, you can buy an NFT, and they could be like baseball cards. I think they're quite easily understood as they reflect some of the cultural things we've been using, like baseball cards, and in fashion as well, a collection in fashion. And one of the obvious reasons for sport is that they get, 50 or 60,000 people sitting in one place. And a lot of those people, they love their team. You know, there's a tribal instinct, you know, we want to have the cap and the scarf, or the t-shirt, and we want to have we want to collect things related to the team that we love, that we suffer and enjoy with. So that in sports, certainly, and it's an easy market, and it's one of the things to be aware of when selling NFTs. If you've got 50,000 people sitting in a stadium, there's your market straight away, and they're coming every week to your stadium. That's a great market. And I think fashion in the same way, people love a particular brand. You know, we have people who love Versace, or who love whatever, iconic brand you're into yourself. Then those people will want to have anything associated with that. You know, you buy a book, you go into the store, you buy anything related to that brand, because it's part of your tribe, and it makes you feel something, and you can keep it at home. You can, just keep it for yourself because you love it so much. So that, for me.
That's a lovely point, Laurence. Frances, anything?
Yeah, so I'm probably, my only added point there would be, things like fashion and sport they're kind of high luxury brands. And again, all I can sort of speak to is my kind of research with kind of the history of virtual worlds. And of course, guess who were the first ones to start exploring virtual worlds and put themselves in there? It was high fashion brands. Because again, presumably because they've got the money to invest in it. It's great to see, though, the fact that we had earlier this year, a fashion week in Decentraland with places like, Dolce & Gabbana presenting virtual works. I mean, I personally find it kind of crazy, but it's perhaps also so funny because, I'm just coming from an art space. So what's really the difference at the end of the day? But yeah, I think, as Laura says, there is this kind of there is also that collectible nature there. People naturally want to collect those sorts of things. So yeah, I think that's probably fueling that market.
I'm just very conscious of time. I think we've only got a few minutes left, really. So I just want to get very briefly, your final thoughts, Chris. Where's the emerging sectors? Where's the future? What do you really want to get across to our listeners today? It could be anything, how do you engage with NFTs? What's the first step? What's your final thoughts for this session?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think right now, the world economies, whether it's your traditional stocks or even crypto, are going to be in a little bit of a bear market for a stretch. But this is the opportunity and the time when really good technology is built. So I would say, investing either in just learning more around these technologies and figuring out how to incorporate or experiment with them. And you can do so at little to no cost, right? But I think fundamentally, I would say the technology is here to stay. And so very similar to the internet or a variety of other new technologies, if you take the time to understand them, you can build some really amazing solutions with the new technology in general.
Frances?
Yeah, I suppose just to kind of echo that, really, I think there is an abundance of information out there now about Web3, covering all sorts of themes and anything you'll find information that resonates with you. And I think if you're interested in it, go explore, go deep dive down the rabbit hole, as they say. You know, it's you know, you'll have loads of fun. You know, there is, what's also really interesting about this space is the kind of communities of people and how welcoming people are as well. You know, if you're thinking about how do I get into this, what do I do, jump into, you know, have a look at things like some of the magazines and things like that, and join their discords, you know, be a ghost for a bit, watch on, and then just ask questions. People are always welcome to answer them. And you know, you'll soon find how interesting it is. But again, it's going down the route that you find is interesting. Don't just simply do it because it's the thing to do.
It's definitely the best way to learn in this space is networking, talking, asking questions, for sure. And finally, Laurence, have you got any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I just want to thank Chris and Francis and Kirsty, of course, and XpoNorth. And I echo everything that was said. Please go and explore and learn. Technology has kept me alive for the last 30 years. And so I think it's a great thing to be involved in new areas, because it's all about the new areas. So thank you, everybody. It's been great to meet you all.
Thanks, Laurence. And I just want to thank everyone. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Francis, it's been great to learn more about your PhD, and I appreciate that. So thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.